Your mouth is dry, not thirsty dry, the kind a sip of water fixes. Cracked lip, swollen tongue, can't swallow dry. Your skin has stopped sweating because there's nothing left to sweat. Your heartbeat feels wrong, too fast, too shallow, like your body is starting to panic before your mind catches up. Now take away the tap. Take away the bottle in your bag, the fridge down the hall, the fountain in the office. Take away every single source of water you've ever taken for granted and put you somewhere dry, somewhere old, somewhere your ancestors actually had to survive. How far would you go to get a drink? Not metaphorically, actually. Would you dig with your bare hands into cracked earth on a guess? Would you drink something you knew might kill you slower than thirst would? Would you leave someone behind? People did. All of it. And what they were willing to do when the water ran out says something about survival that's easy to forget sitting here with a glass an arm's length away. Let's be clear about the timeline first because most people badly underestimate it. A human can survive weeks without food. Without water, you're looking at somewhere between 3 and 7 days, and that's under decent conditions. In heat, in a desert, doing physical work to find more water, that window shrinks fast, sometimes down to a single day. And it's not a clean shutdown. Long before death, the body starts failing in ways that make survival harder, not easier. Judgment goes first. Coordination goes next. People wandering the desert dying of thirst have been found walking in circles, tearing off their own clothes because the brain misreads the burning skin as burning fabric, moving away from the water instead of toward it. Thirst doesn't just weaken you. It makes you stupid at exactly the moment you can least afford to be. So the first thing ancient humans had to master wasn't strength. It was finding water in places that looked like they had none at all. In the driest parts of the world, water rarely announces itself. There's no stream, no lake, nothing on the surface. But it's often still there, hidden just beneath. Indigenous trackers across Australia's deserts learned to read specific plants, tree roots that only grow near underground moisture, as literal maps. Dig at the base of a particular eucalyptus, and you might find a root that, when cut and drained, releases drinkable water stored inside it. Entire survival strategies were built around memorizing which plants meant water below and which ones were traps, decoys that looked identical but held nothing. Getting that identification wrong wasn't a minor mistake. It could cost the hours you didn't have. Animals gave away secrets too. Certain birds fly in near straight lines toward water sources at dawn and dusk, and trackers learned to read their flight paths like directions. Bees rarely nest more than a few miles from a reliable source. Even insect activity on the ground could hint at moisture just beneath the surface. None of this was guesswork passed down as superstition. It was decades, sometimes generations, of observation refined into knowledge that could mean the difference between finding water in hours or dying while searching for days. And when none of that worked, people dug. Not casually, desperately. Sip wells, shallow pits scraped into dry riverbeds where water still moved invisibly underground, have been used by desert peoples for thousands of years. You'd dig, wait for the hole to slowly fill with water seeping through the sand, and drink from a puddle barely larger than a cupped hand. It was slow. It was filthy. It worked often enough that entire communities built their movements around knowing exactly where these hidden points were, season after season, generation after generation. But even with all of that knowledge, sometimes it still wasn't enough. And that's where things stop being clever and start being desperate. When primary sources failed completely, people turned to water no sane person would choose. Muddy pools where animals had been wallowing, water pooled with visible decay in it. In some documented cases, people drank their own urine as a last resort, understanding on some level that it was a short-term gamble, since urine becomes more concentrated and dangerous the longer dehydration continues, but choosing the immediate relief over the longer-term risk because immediate was the only time frame that mattered anymore. Explorers and survivors in more recent recorded history describe this same desperate math again and again. When the alternative is death in hours, drinking something dangerous that might buy you another day stops being a hard decision. And then there's the part of this story that's harder to sit with, because it's not about what people drank. It's about what people did to each other. Water scarcity has a brutal way of exposing what a group is really made of. Anthropological and historical records from drought-prone regions across Africa, the Middle East, and the Americas describe a consistent, uncomfortable pattern. As water sources shrink, conflict over them intensifies. And it doesn't stay abstract. Wells were guarded, sometimes violently. Groups that had shared a source for generations turned on each other when a drought stretched long enough that sharing stopped being survivable for everyone. Skeletal remains from certain drought-era archaeological sites in the American Southwest show trauma patterns consistent with intergroup violence clustering suspiciously close to periods of severe, sustained water shortage. It's not proof of a single cause. History rarely offers something that clean, but the correlation shows up again and again in different eras and different continents, which is its own kind of evidence. There's a darker layer still, one that historical accounts and oral traditions across multiple drought-stricken cultures return to independently: the abandonment of the weak. When a group is moving, searching, trying to reach the next known water source before their bodies give out, someone who can't keep pace becomes a mathematical problem as much as a moral one. The old, the very young, the injured. Some accounts describe groups making the agonizing calculation that carrying someone who couldn't walk meant risking the survival of everyone and choosing, in the most desperate droughts, to leave them behind with whatever meager supplies could be spared, because arriving as a smaller group alive was judged better than arriving as no group at all. It's not framed in the old accounts as cruelty, it's framed as the least bad option inside a set of options that were all catastrophic. That distinction doesn't make it easier to hear. It just makes it more honest about what real scarcity does to real people. This is the part of ancient survival that doesn't get romanticized, and for good reason. It's not clever tool use or ingenious tracking. It's the raw, unfiltered evidence of what happens when a resource everyone needs to live simply stops being available to everyone. The tools and the tracking kept people alive for a while, but when even that failed, what's left exposed underneath is just human beings making the kind of choices no one wants to imagine themselves making, and somehow still making them. So how did anyone survive this long enough for any of us to exist at all? The honest answer isn't toughness. It's the same answer that shows up again and again across every survival story from this era: cooperation, knowledge, and memory. The groups that survived droughts weren't necessarily the strongest. They were the ones who remembered where the last hidden water source had been 3 dry seasons ago. They were the ones who'd shared that knowledge with neighboring groups instead of hoarding it, because a favor given during someone else's crisis might be the favor that saves you during your own. Oral traditions across water-scarce regions are dense with exactly this kind of information, passed down not as folklore, but as literal survival infrastructure. Which spring dries up first? Which one never fails? Which plant roots mean water is close? A community with that knowledge intact had a real advantage over one without it, regardless of how physically strong its individual members were. And there's something almost unbearably human in that. The same species capable of leaving someone behind on the worst day of a drought was also the species capable of teaching a stranger's grandchildren where to dig 30 years later. Both of those things are true, and both happened, sometimes within the same small group of people, sometimes within the same lifetime. Survival wasn't a straight line from cruelty to kindness. It was both, constantly, depending entirely on how much water was left. Tonight, you're going to get up at some point and get a glass of water without thinking about it for a fraction of a second. You won't check the sky for the shape of a bird's flight path. You won't dig into dry ground on a guess and wait for a puddle to slowly appear. You won't have to look at someone you love and calculate whether they can survive the next 3 days of walking. That entire calculation, the one that shaped so much of who survived and who didn't for most of human history, has simply vanished from your life. So completely that it probably never even crossed your mind before this video. That's not a small thing. That's one of the largest, quietest victories your species has ever won, and almost nobody alive today has ever had to notice it happening.